Hello, and welcome to GreenTV. I'm Tom Brown, your host today. GreenTV is brought to you by the St. Joe Valley Greens in South Bend, Indiana. Please check our website and come visit us. Investigative journalism is hard work, legally and financially risky, even dangerous. Greg Palast is probably the greatest investigative reporter you've never heard of. He works for the British Guardian newspapers. His column is printed in The Observer, and he hosts BBC Television's Newsnight. In 1999, Palast reopened the investigation into the Exxon Valdez tragedy and pointed a damning finger at British Petroleum and Alyeska, the Alaskan pipeline company. Palast was a power industry investigator in the 80s and in the 90s and revealed how Houston Oil and Gas, operating under the alias Enron, persuaded Margaret Thatcher to deregulate energy production in the UK, the first such deregulation in the hemisphere. Deregulation fever eventually arrived in the U.S. and plunged us into pre-1933 looting of energy consumers' pockets. In 1989, Palast did the initial investigative work which laid bare corporate thievery in the California energy industry and which led to the eventual fall of Enron and Arthur Andersen. Palast broke the story on the systematic voting fraud in Florida in 2000, which abetted the theft of the presidency in 2000. Since 2000, Palast has concentrated on the biggest threat to democracy yet, targeted voting fraud made possible by massive computer databases and electronic voting machines in the service of crooked politicians. If you don't watch GreenTV for the rest of this year, you absolutely must see our next 3 shows. Now here's part 1 of Greg Palast's talk, Florida Gate and Beyond.
To all of you. Greg Palast. One of my personal heroes. Greg is, as you know, one of the most incredible or they call him the best investigative reporter of our times. He also has a television show on BBC. He reports for the Guardian newspapers. Greg is currently on his 10-week tour doing 27 cities. And if you got the book tonight, that book is only going to be available on Tuesday. So in fact, KPFK was the first, I think one of the first to do Greg's book. Greg is also known in the United States through KPFK Radio and Pacifica. There's not anywhere else in the media or very limited acknowledgement of Greg's work. You know, Catherine, the White House, I know Greg thinks this is one of the most interesting things that's being said about Greg Palast. The White House says, we hate that son of a bitch. That's a good one. Michael Moore calls his reporting courageous, and Britain's Tribune calls him the greatest investigator of our time, and it's great to have him out here tonight. He's a receiver of many awards, but mostly he's received an award that is equal to the Pulitzer Prize. Greg is known for his work of investigating or uncovering the story of Enron, of exposing Jeb Bush for stealing the elections in Florida, and I'm sure he will talk about that here tonight. His book, The Best Democracy Can Buy, was on the bestseller list for the New York Times as well as the LA Times. Greg says he believes that the reason why it's on the bestseller list for the LA Times is because the work of KPFK and giving a voice on KPFK. The Baltimore Chronicle says no one has investigated the Bush Klan and lived to write about it. The legendary investigative reporter Greg Palast, live here in the house, brought to you by KPFK. Greg?
Oh, sit down already. Let's talk. Let's talk. It's been a while. I brought some coffee, so at least one of us will be awake. You know, this is, by the way, in case you don't know it, when you're talking about journalists who are heroes, there is one. You just met one, Eva. You know that when she was uncovering the corruption in the apartheid regime of South Africa, because it wasn't just about oppressing black people, that was the cover for an operation for people lining their pockets, selling drugs. It was a criminal, it wasn't just the government, the apartheid government, it was a criminal enterprise. And for that, for exposing that, Eva had guns put to her head. How many times? And her answer whenever she was threatened, when there was a gun in her face, was, pull the trigger. You've got a hero here. Thank God they didn't. But I want to talk about another hero, as long as I'm here, a war hero, President George W. Bush. Hey! I guess you haven't heard about total information awareness. They know who's laughing. No, he really was, unlike our draft-dodging philanderer that we had before the current upstanding president. We really had George W. Bush served honorably during the war in Vietnam in the Texas Air Guard. You're laughing, but don't forget, during the war in Vietnam, not once did the Viet Cong dare to attack Houston. And so this guy knows what war is all about. When he sends, so he's more than happy to send other people into the desert. I know that we're being attacked by Osama bin Laden's organization, but our president thinks it's a good idea to run off to play Lawrence of Arabia. So I actually wanted to go back to George W. and his war years, and because it came up because while he had the job, he was a fighter pilot in the Texas Air Force, and he was doing it well. And how did he get his kind of like Top Gun Tom Cruise gig? I was kind of interested because this week, it just came to me literally, I was thinking about this week because our president has come out strongly against affirmative action, saying that merit should determine who gets the good positions. Hey. Okay, keep it up. So I looked at Bush's war career and how he got that position. He took a test to be a fighter pilot, our president, and he scored, out of a possible 100, he scored 25 points, which is literally 1 point above too dumb to be allowed into a cockpit. Now, there were literally thousands of eager Top Guns in Texas who wanted that job, many who scored 100 out of 100. So I looked into the affirmative action program that was at work here. Now this was an issue in the Texas gubernatorial campaign against Ann Richards, who he defeated by hair. Now, the issue was, did George W. Bush have strings pulled for him? And he absolutely stone cold denied it. There was no evidence, and he won the governorship, and the issue was dropped. Well, I didn't drop it. Talk about issues being dropped. You kind of hear it over at NBC, you just hear pump into the trash. The reason it came back to me is that just a few years ago, a guy named Ben Barnes got a $23 million check from a corporation called G-Tech. you can see where this is getting around. By the way, I'm going to give you a warning. For those of you who saw me on Politically Incorrect, you know that I've been called a conspiracy nut, which always gets a laugh from the conspirators. There was this $23 million payment from this G-Tech Corporation to Ben Barnes. Now, G-Tech Corporation ran the state lottery of Texas, which is the most lucrative lottery, earning billions for this corporation. They had the contract, but they were about to lose it because they got caught in kind of hiring boyfriends of the state directors, and money was going to places it shouldn't be, and there was some bribery, et cetera. And so they were about to lose their contract for the Texas State Lottery while George W. was governor. And there was a bid to replace them. They had their contract pulled. They had a new director of the state lottery who was uncorruptible, who said these guys have got to go. They picked a new lottery operator through a bid. And then suddenly, George W. Bush's Lottery Commission fired the new director, pulled the contract from the new operator, and gave it to G-Tech Corporation without a bid. Now, $23 million to someone named Ben Barnes. He had been a Democratic lieutenant governor of Texas during the war in Vietnam. So then, it turns out, one question was, it seems that Mr. Barnes, as it turns out, had called the head of the Texas Air Guard, General Craig Rose, and suggested that one of the most deserving men to keep his white behind out of Vietnam was Congressman George Bush's son, W. And W got the job in the Air Guard. Now, no one knew this, that Barnes had made this call to the general that the fix was in. But G-Tech seemed to have known this. And they paid Mr. Barnes $23 million. And he had a conversation with the governor, and suddenly G-Tech had its contract back, no bid. Now, if you look into the files of the U.S. Attorney's Office, but most journalists with the network would not look into the files of the Attorney General's office, a document came my way in which it was explained that Mr. Barnes had a conversation with the governor's people about what Mr. Barnes knew about our war hero. Now, that has nothing to do with G-Tech getting their contract back. And I'm sure George, that the fix was not put in. But this was, understand, just before his move into business as a successful businessman. He was hired as an advisor by something called the Carlyle Group, the young W, and he was an advisor or board member to something called Cater Air, and he was paid about $50,000 for his acumen and services. Well, Cater Air went bankrupt, but though not Carlyle. In fact, actually, if you look in the most recent budget, our budget-busting budget to fight the war on terror, to fight the meanies out there, there is $450 million for something called the Crusader, which is a self-propelled howitzer. It's kind of a tank. The problem with the tank is that it's a very heavy, kind of unwieldy piece of equipment that needs kind of a bulldozer in front of it to kind of clear the way. The Army objected to the idea that they would find volunteers for the guys in the bulldozer. So the Army's objected, but Bush thought $450 million would still be a good idea for the Crusader, which is backed and funded by the Carlyle Group, of which he is no longer part of, but his daddy works for. Daddy Bush. I mean, there's a lot of patriotism in the current budget. I was thinking about that because, for example, I was just looking at Lockheed, which is was one of the biggest donors to the Bush campaign. They are building something called the Virginia-class submarine. $1.6 billion for each one. They are attack subs to attack the Soviet submarine fleet. There is no Soviet submarine fleet. We're ordering a dozen. And, but, this is serious. They are been converted because we have new enemies. We always have new enemies. And the new enemy, well, first was to fight the war on terror and get even with those who attacked us in September of 2001. So it was proposed as a weapon to help us in the war in Afghanistan, which okay, yes, Afghanistan's landlocked. Okay, but you have to understand how much these guys gave to the campaign. Well, now I shouldn't put it that way. There is actually in Iraq a tiny little area of shoreline where the sellers of these miracle machines, these huge $1.6 billion submarines, so they had to convert these to war on terror machines. So they said the way to fight the war on terror, because bin Laden's submarine fleet is limited too, is in Iraq, is that you could use this submarine, which is about 4 times the size of this room, to land commandos on the beach. Well, it's because of its size, it's like moving the Empire State Building in quietly. The Israelis had an alternative method. They suggested canoes, right? But this is like a $1.6 trillion ship, $1 billion ship, so you got to move it in slowly. So how do you get them into the beach without being noticed? You put the Marines in torpedoes. It's in the budget. $1.6 billion each. Okay. Well, for a good reason, because, Bush has told us, our president has told us, excuse me. I've sometimes been anthrax. Bush has said that there are thousands of people out there who are trying to kill us. And they are supported, and there are, we know that, and they have supporters and funders. But he could have added in that speech, and some of them are my business partners. Now, I didn't know that. Daddy's friends too. Now, George W. is one very lucky guy. He made it rich in the oil business in Texas, which is unusual because he never struck oil. He's one of the only oil guys in Texas. He drilled holes all over Texas, one dry hole after another. But then he was able to, but where he lucked out is when he drilled into the pockets of a couple of Gulf state sheikhs and hit it right. There was a company, he had a company, Arbusto, which means shrub, which was turned into something called Spectrum, which was bought out by a company called Harkin Oil. And Harkin Oil was saved by a huge, fortuitous, and seemingly odd investment by someone named, by a sheikh named Abdullah Baksh, B-A-K-S-H. Now, I've kind of filed that in my back of my head somewhere. And then what happened is, in fact, last time I was talking to you, and in the last version of my book, or just beginning, I won an award. Actually, I won an award you don't want to get. I won from California State University. The project censored story for the most censored story of the year. I said, well, thanks. You know, it's like, it was a story which was on the top of the BBC News, front page of the British papers, but it's censored because it was blacked out in the United States. And this was about, it came from this, which, these are pages that came through from the files of the FBI marked 199I, which is a code within the national security agencies for national security. So it's a national security document. It's marked secret. If you want to know how I got this? Well, the FBI came to visit one of my researchers I was working with. And they asked some questions about some God knows what. And they accidentally left a file on my researcher's desk. Now, I'm not the type of guy to go through. Anyway, they called a little while later, a half hour later, and said, you know, we think we left a file on your desk. You haven't read it, have you? They say, well, we'll be back to pick it up in a half an hour, unless you need 40 minutes. I mean, one could say that maybe some angry agents wanted us to see a few things that are secret. I'll tell you what's in it. Well, we all believe in total information awareness. Now I'm going to make you totally aware, whether you like it or not. It's a simple thing. It's an investigative report on a couple members of the bin Laden family in the United States. Now, by the way, just because your name is bin Laden doesn't mean you're a killer, berserker, or a terrorist, or anything else. Let's get off that. However, the FBI agents had wanted to investigate two members of the bin Laden family who were in the United States, connected to an organization they considered a suspected terrorist organization called WAMI. Okay. Now, and they were told, no, that's not nice. This is before September 11th. This file was reactivated September 13th, 2001, a little late. The bin Ladens had fled, and the agents were not so happy. See, because the bin Laden family, the line of the Bush family is that the bin Ladens have a black sheep named Osama. And I would say he's about a pretty nasty little sheep. But the rest are all like, you know, white little lambs. But some of the FBI agents were saying, well, there's maybe a couple gray sheep in that flock, and we'd like to talk to them. And this organization, WAMI, by the way, just a couple weeks ago, someone in that organization was arrested in Somalia as the conduit of those audio tapes that came from Osama bin Laden. So it's not like the FBI, sometimes they don't, you know, sometimes they get it wrong, but maybe there was something to look at here, but they were told, don't look. Now, by the way, did I mention to you that the bin Laden family funded the Carlyle Corporation? There's nothing to do with anything. I don't like, you know, people are making connections here. I can see that in your eyes. Now, one thing, and I actually want to make this very clear. This is no joke. I have never found any evidence that George Bush knew about the September 11th attack in advance, or, God forbid, had a hand in planning it. It's like a level that someone got 25 out of 100 is not capable of anyway. You know, it's like those who believe that happens have a belief in the intellectual planning ability of our chief. But this is an important story. According to the agents, according to agents from not only, these were low-level agents of the FBI. There were also, we spoke with, when I say we, BBC television, spoke with high-level people in the CIA, DIA consortium, National Security Agency consortium, who told us that they were told before September 11th, you can't look at Saudi Arabian financing of terror. That's a no-go area. Now, it may be for intelligent, political, policy reasons. You know, we don't want to disturb the guys sitting on our oil spigot. You have to understand how the Saudis, you know, whatever reason is. I'm not going to try to impute anything to it. But I was very interested in one thing that wasn't, what were they told not to look at? I asked for some specific things. Well, one thing that I found interesting is that BBC learned, and we confirmed this from two completely separate sources, that there was a meeting in Paris in May, June 1996. I have the exact location, I have the list of participants, in which arms dealers and Saudi Arabian billionaires got together and decided how much money would go to various Islamic Wahhabi charities, and including how much would go to Al-Qaeda. Not that they were in love with Al-Qaeda, but it was at the time of the Khobar Towers attack, 19 US servicemen were killed by Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia. And it was, how much do we have to pay you to go play somewhere else?